Once upon a time, once a long time ago, once last week, once right now, once in the distant memory of our great grandparents. There was a family living in a village. The father grew up in that village, as had his ancestors for hundreds of years. But the mother was from the village on the other side of the forest. And even though she'd been living there for 15 years, she was still referred to as the stranger, the foreigner. Because in this village, people didn't marry from other villages. And there was a boy, Peter, of about 8, and a girl of 14. Whose name has been forgotten. All that can be remembered of this one, or so I've heard, is Ridinghood. And the mother had just given birth to a 3rd child. And word had come to her that her mother had been ill. And because she was still in childbed and was not able to go, she called her daughter to her and told her to go and bring her grandmother bread and butter and wine. But first she should bring her brother, Peter, to his grandparents in the village, because the mother could not care for him while Ridinghood was away. And so Ridinghood packed her basket, excited for the journey. It was the first time she will have gone through the forest on her own. She'd been there many times with her mother to visit her grandmother, but it was the first time she was being asked to go. She took her little brother by the hand and the basket in the other, and they walked through the village to the grandparents' house. And Peter skipped and jumped. He walked 3 steps forward and 2 steps back, left and right, and twirled around, could barely keep his sister's hand. He was so excited. He wondered if his grandfather would take him fishing today, or hunting, or birding, or if he would be able to catch snakes and frogs and insects in the garden. And he already was planning to sneak over the garden fence to go visit his favorite tree with the hole in it where he liked to sit inside. The lightning tree. And when they arrived, there was a cake already baked on the windowsill, cooling. And then Ridinghood left in the beautiful spring. The sunshine and the birds' song with her basket, to walk through the forest, where the spring flowers were blooming under the trees. And she began to sing with the birds. And sometimes she had to pause and put her head into the sun. And slowly she made her way to the crossroads. And at the crossroads, minding his own business in a kind of sun meditation, as dogs are wont to do, was the wolf. Head up, eyes closed, nose to the sun. Ears awake, twitching and turning, and the rest of him totally still. Hearing the crunch of feet on gravel, he turned his nose to smell who might be coming and cracked open his eye. "Good morning," said Ridinghood. "Morning," said Wolf, yawning and showing all of his beautiful teeth. "Where are you off to today?" "I'm going to grandmother's. She's been ill, and I get to go for the first time through the forest all by myself. I have cake from my grandmother, and I have bread, and I have butter, and I have a little bottle of wine." "Aha," said the wolf. "And which path will you take? The right or the left? The path of pins or the path of needles?" Red Ridinghood looked. "I will take the path of pins," she said. And she began to walk. And the flowers grew because more sun fell on that path. And she thought, "Oh, I'll pick some flowers for grandmother." And so she began to wander from the path, caught by the beauty of one, the way the sunlight shone through the petals and made a particular kind of gold, a kind of glitter. And she just couldn't resist going one after the other, deeper and deeper into the forest from the path. The wolf, of course, had taken the path of needles to get there quicker and more directly to grandmother's house. And when he arrived, he knocked on the door. "Who is it?" called grandmother. "It is I, Ridinghood," said Wolf. "Oh, I'm too sick to come to the door." "Pick up the latch and come on in." And so Wolf entered on padded feet, silently. Whisper light through the hallway, and he looked through the door, which was cracked open, and saw grandmother lying there with her eyes closed. And he thought, well, hey, it's a wolf's job to take care of the old and the sick, right? I have to call the herd. And so he ran over to the bed and snapped up grandmother in one bite. And then he started to think about the plump and delicious and young girl on her way with a basket of cake and butter and bread. And while those things might suitable for his domesticated cousins, he was much more interested in the girl than the contents of her basket. And so he slipped into grandmother's nightgown and into grandmother's sleeping cap and snuggled himself into bed, took a little nap, a little digestion nap, while he waited for Ridinghood to appear. She walked lazily and slowly through the forest. She'd been there so many times to her grandmother's house that she wasn't lost. She knew exactly where she was. In fact, you see, there was the stream just ahead. She just had to follow that until she arrived at the 3 oaks under which her grandmother's house stood. Listening to the rushing of the water, full, the river full, almost to overflowing with snow melt. There in the distance, she saw the 3 oaks and knew she was almost there. Resisting the temptation to eat the cake in her basket, she kept walking more quickly now so that she could get there to have something to eat with her grandmother. And arriving at the door, she knocked. "Who is it?" called the wolf. "It's me. Hi, grandmother. It's me, Ridinghood. I've come with a basket for you from mother. She's doing well. May I come in?" Hearing nothing, she lifted the latch and walked in. It was quite still in the house. She heard heavy breathing. Walking into the kitchen, she set down the basket, washed her hands, took off her cloak, and called out to her grandmother. "Grandmother, shall I bring you some cake?" Hearing nothing, she decided to put it onto a plate and bring it with her into her grandmother's room, just in case her grandmother was of a mind to share. She, too, looked through the cracked open door and saw a heap of a creature, a heap of a being in the bed. And assuming it was her grandmother, she walked in. But she immediately noticed that something was a little bit off. The eyes that fixed themselves upon her were not the eyes of her grandmother. It smelled different in the room. It smelled somehow bestial, sort of like, not human. But she wasn't sure because her grandmother had been sick and she didn't really know what was wrong with her grandmother, and so she took another step closer to the bed to see what was going on. "Grandmother," she said, "is it you?" "Oh, yes, Yes, dear, answered the wolf. My grandmother, but you look so different. What big ears you have. Ah, the better to hear you with. Grandmother, what large arms you have. Oh, the better to hug you with. Come here, child. Grandmother, what big teeth you have. The better to eat you with! And the wolf sprang up out of the bed, leaving the bedclothes, the nightdress, and the cap behind, and jumped in one fell swoop over to Red Riding Hood, gobbling her up as well. Now you can imagine the weight in the wolf's stomach with two full-grown creatures, human creatures, in it. And so, groaning, he collapsed onto the floor, staying where he lay. Groaning, slightly in pain, thinking he'd probably taken it a little bit far. The wolf groaned. And he made such a commotion that two hunters that were walking by outside heard him. And knowing very well that no grandmother they knew that lived in that house would make such noises unless she was very much in trouble, they came running into the house, finding the wolf with the distended belly laying on the floor, unable to move. Inside, while the wolf groaned and writhed, Red Riding Hood and her grandmother sat, curled around each other in the dark and the wet, held quite close in the belly of this creature. It smelled sour and strange, bloody and unfamiliar, and Red Riding Hood grew quite scared. If it hadn't been for grandmother there holding her, she probably would have started screaming. But as it were, she did start to whimper. Which the hunters heard coming out of the belly of the wolf. And so one of them took a knife and sliced very, very delicately and very expertly down the belly of the wolf, opening up the creature so that Riding Hood and grandmother might emerge out of the bowels of this one. Oh! Looking around, their eyes hurting from the sudden light, seeing the two hunters there, looking down at the wolf whose body lay around their feet, opened, bloody and alive. They stepped gingerly from the wolf's body onto the floor. The hunters, having gone outside, returned with stones, which they put into the belly of the wolf, and they began to sew the body closed. Then carrying the pitiful creature out of the house. It dumped him in the river, where he drowned. Collapsing into each other's arms, weeping with relief, Ridinghood and her grandmother walked out into the sunshine, bringing the basket with them. And they sat together, the two hunters and the grandmother and Ridinghood, and they ate the cake and the bread with butter and drank the wine. And they tried to forget. Except they still smelled like the inside of wolf. So grandmother gave Ridinghood other clothes. They washed themselves, changed their clothes, and Ridinghood started to make her way back home. On the path, quickly. Just wanted to get home. But she knew she had to go pick up her little brother, so she walked through the forest as if in a daze. No idea how to make sense of what had just happened to her. She walked through the forest, barely hearing, barely seeing, one foot after the other, numb. Back to her grandparents' house in the village. But when she arrived there, she arrived in the middle of a parade. There was her grandfather. There was her brother. She could just see them over the shoulders of the people in the village. And she heard the people speaking. Did you see? Did you see the wolf? Why is that little boy walking there? He saved us. He saved us. The boy saved us. He caught the wolf. Where are they taking him? And as she walked through the crowd, Red Riding Hood heard one snippet after another until she arrived at her grandmother's house. Where she had left her little brother that morning. And the cake grandmother grabbed her in her arms and held her, noticing she smelled different than when she had left that morning, looking into her eyes, seeing that she was different than when she had left that morning, and that she was wearing different clothes than when she had been there that morning. But there was no time to go into those details now, because her husband and Riding Hood's brother were on their way to the zoo with a wolf. And so grandmother and Red Riding Hood went back to Riding Hood's house and waited. An hour later, as the sun was sending golden, slanted rays of springtime, and the air was quickly getting cold again, and the fires were being lit, and the lamps were being lit. Grandfather and Peter arrived home. And as Peter saw his sister, he began to excitedly jump around and tell her the story. "Oh, it was so incredible! You wouldn't believe it! I caught a wolf!" He jumped up and down, Riding Hood, grabbing him, holding him, hugging him, breathing with him. "What happened?" she asked. "Well, I was playing in the garden. Playing just until grandmother and grandfather went back inside, and I knew I could slip through the garden gate. And I went out to go be with my tree, And I guess I left the garden gate open, because a little while later I heard the duck from Grandma and Grandpa on the lake. And the duck was having a fight with the bird about whether the duck should be swimming or flying. And the bird seemed to know a lot about that it was better to fly. And the duck seemed to know a lot about that it was better to swim. And they were making such an awful racket that I had to come running. And when I got to the lake, I saw that the cat from the neighbors, the orange one with the stripes, the cat from the neighbors was sneaking up behind the bird, who was distracted because the bird and the duck were fighting, about whether they should be flying or whether they should be swimming. And the cat was coming very slowly, stalking the bird and about to jump on the bird. And so I jumped in the lake and I started making a big racket. Well, you know that the wolves have been closer to the village because they've been hungry and they've been looking for food, as they do at the end of winter when the spring begins. And, well, Grandfather told me not to go into the forest because he told me that the wolves were there, but I just couldn't resist going to be with the lightning tree. And then I had to go be with the pond and the duck and the bird because I had left the gate open. And then I was trying to get the duck to get back into the barnyard, the gate with the, because I had let the duck out. Anyway, the wolf heard all the commotion and came over, and I got scared and ran away. So I went into the barn and I got a rope. And I climbed up onto the roof of the barn, like we do sometimes, and over onto the tree limb. Because the wolf was right below the limb of the tree. The wolf was going after the duck. I had to save the duck. And as I got to the limb of the tree, I put a noose in the rope, and I hung the rope down over the big, strong tree limb. And I slipped it over the tail of the wolf. And I pulled it shut. And I jumped down off the roof, and the wolf was hanging up in the sky, hanging from the roof of the limb of the tree, and I was down on the ground by the barn, and I didn't know what to do, and I started to cry because I was stuck. The wolf was up in the tree, and I was down on the ground, and I couldn't let go because if I let go, the wolf will come down and eat me. And then two hunters came. Two hunters came, and they were gonna kill the wolf. They put their guns to their shoulders, and they looked at the wolf through that thing that's on the gun that they have to look through in order to aim. But I didn't want them to shoot the wolf. So I yelled, and I stopped them, and I said, "No, let's bring the wolf to the zoo." And the hunters looked, and they had no idea what the boy was talking about. The zoo? Why would we bring the wolf to the zoo? The wolf eats our sheep, and the wolf attacks our people and eats our children. And why would we bring the wolf to the zoo? But Peter started to yell and cajole and scream and jump up and down and grab them by the shirt tails and the pants and try and pull on the gun and pull it down until they finally said, "Okay, fine, enough, we'll bring the wolf to the zoo, just stop." And they slowly lowered the wolf down and trussed him up and began to carry the wolf through the streets. And of course, Grandfather had come out because of all the commotion, and Peter and Grandfather started to walk through the streets of the village. And as they were going, all the people from the houses started to come out, because you know how it is in villages where the grandmothers look out of the windows over their geraniums and watch what's going on in the village. And so every single one of them saw that a wolf, trussed up, was being carried through the center of the village, very much alive. And Peter was shouting, "We're bringing him to the zoo! We're bringing him to the zoo!" And he was dancing. musicians came along, and drummers came along, and children came along, and the people walked and brought the wolf to the zoo. And after Peter had told Ridinghood the whole story, he was kind of exhausted from such a big day. And they went in to have supper, and he couldn't even keep his eyes open while he was eating. He kept taking a bite and then falling asleep at the table. And so his father brought him to bed. And Red Riding Hood's mother looked over at her and saw how quiet Riding Hood was being. She saw, just like her mother-in-law had, that she was wearing different clothes. And there was a different look in her eyes than there had been that morning. And so she turned towards her daughter and asked, "And how was your day, darling?" "And how was my mother? Did she enjoy the bread and the butter and the wine?" And Red Riding Hood could only look at her mother and say, "She's resting well. And she'll be all right." Because how do you tell the story of having been on the inside of a wolf? And being rescued by hunters, and watching as they sewed stones into the wolf's belly and carried it to the river to drown it. There are some stories that can't be told. Some things you know that you can never speak. That change you. That set you on a path to become who you never thought you would become. That it takes a lifetime to grow into and grow through. And now I've told you, my story has come to an end. So, my dears, slowly gathering the bundle of the story,